In the quiet town of Millfield, Ohio, where cornfields stretched endlessly and life moved at a slower pace than in the bustling cities, the Hayes family lived in a modest two-story house on Maplewood Lane. At first glance, they looked like any other middle-class family trying to make a living. The father, Robert Hayes, was 45 years old and worked sporadically in construction, although his reputation was far from that of a hard-working provider. The mother, Linda Hayes, stayed at home most of the time, juggling occasional part-time jobs while carrying the heavy burden of keeping the household together. And then there was Samantha Hayes, their only daughter, a 17-year-old high school student whose life would eventually be defined not by her grades or her future dreams, but by one violent act that shocked the entire community. The Hayes household had long been filled with tension. Neighbors often noticed raised voices drifting through the thin walls of the small house. Robert had developed a reputation not just within his home but also in town. Known to spend late nights at bars, he often returned home reeking of alcohol, his temper sharpened by intoxication. His marriage to Linda had deteriorated years earlier, but they had stayed together, partly because of Samantha and partly because Linda had nowhere else to go. Financially, the family was unstable. Robert rarely contributed consistent support, often spending his earnings on himself rather than providing for his wife and daughter. Linda quietly took on odd jobs, cleaning houses, helping at the local diner, just to keep food on the table and pay utility bills. Samantha grew up watching this imbalance. As a little girl, she remembered sitting in her bedroom with her hands covering her ears whenever her father's angry shouts filled the hallway. Robert's criticisms were sharp, directed mostly at Linda. He accused her of being lazy, ungrateful, and wasteful, despite the fact that she was the one holding the household together. To Samantha, these attacks felt like daggers to her own chest. She loved her mother deeply and resented her father for the way he treated her. By the time she entered high school, Samantha's view of her father had hardened into something close to hatred. She saw him as a selfish man, someone who failed to fulfill the most basic responsibility of being a parent, to love and protect his family. Rumors about Robert's infidelity had reached Samantha's ears more than once. Some came from whispers in town, others from her own observations, text messages flashing across his phone screen, unfamiliar women calling late at night, the scent of cheap perfume on his clothes. For Samantha, these were confirmations of what she already knew. Her father was not only failing as a provider but also betraying the woman who had sacrificed everything for their family. The emotional toll was heavy. At school, Samantha kept mostly to herself, her teachers noticing a quiet, withdrawn student who rarely smiled. She had friends, but she rarely invited them to her home. She feared they would witness the chaos inside her house, the constant arguments, and the toxic atmosphere that suffocated her daily life. The Hayes home was supposed to be a place of comfort, yet for Samantha, it felt like a prison. Linda tried to shield her daughter as best as she could. She often told Samantha to focus on her studies and ignore her father's behavior. But Samantha, wise beyond her years, understood that ignoring the problem did not make it go away. She had seen her mother cry in the bathroom late at night when she thought no one could hear. She had heard the cruel words Robert hurled at her during fights. Each of these moments planted seeds of anger deep within Samantha, anger that grew year by year. Despite the instability at home, Samantha had once dreamed of escaping Millfield and building a better life. She wanted to go to college, perhaps study psychology or nursing, something that would allow her to help people. But as time passed, her dreams began to fade under the weight of her family's dysfunction. She struggled to concentrate on her schoolwork. At times, she even questioned whether she would ever get the chance to leave. The constant turmoil at home made it almost impossible to focus on anything else. The Hayes family was known in Millfield but not admired. People whispered about Robert's temper, his drinking, and his suspected affairs. Some pitted Linda and her daughter, others simply looked away, not wanting to get involved in another family's problems. In small towns, silence often replaced intervention. And so the cycle of conflict within the Hayes home continued, largely unchecked by the outside world. What no one realized at the time was that the years of emotional neglect, verbal abuse, and broken trust were slowly shaping Samantha's path toward a tragic decision. The resentment she carried toward her father was not sudden. It had been simmering for years, hidden behind quiet eyes and a polite demeanor at school. Behind closed doors, however, the cracks in the Hayes family had widened to the point where something had to give. On the surface, Samantha was just another teenager in Millfield, preparing for her senior year, talking occasionally about college applications, and dreaming faintly about a future away from her small town. But inside her, there was a storm brewing, one fueled by years of witnessing her father's cruelty toward her mother and his indifference toward her own needs. By the summer of 2021, that storm was nearing its breaking point. By the summer of 2021, Millfield, Ohio, looked the same as it always had: quiet streets, small diners, a single movie theater, and neighbors who had known one another for decades. Yet behind the walls of a simple house on Maplewood Lane, the Hayes family's struggles were deepening in ways that no one outside fully understood. 17-year-old Samantha Hayes was about to begin her senior year at Millfield High School. Her classmates saw her as reserved, sometimes even distant, but not unfriendly. She was the type of student who kept her head down, sat in the middle row of class, and did her work without drawing much attention. Her teachers described her as polite and intelligent, but they also noticed her frequent fatigue and lack of enthusiasm. What they did not know was that many of those sleepless nights were spent listening to her parents argue in the next room, her father's voice rising with anger while her mother's responses grew weaker each time. Robert Hayes, her father, was a man whose life had taken a steady downward turn. At 45, he was no longer the strong, reliable worker he had once been in his 20s. Injuries from construction work, combined with heavy drinking, had left him unreliable and often unemployed. He spent much of his time at bars on the outskirts of town. On several occasions, neighbors had seen his truck parked outside a woman's house late at night, rumors spreading quickly in a town as small as Millfield. For Robert, excuses came easily. He would tell Linda he was working late or catching up with old friends, but Linda's patience had long worn thin. She knew what the late nights meant. Linda Hayes, 42, had once been known as one of the friendliest women in town. She worked part-time at a local diner, her warm smile and kind words making her popular among regular customers. But at home, she was a different person, tired, cautious, and weighed down by the constant emotional pressure of her marriage. She rarely spoke out against Robert, knowing that doing so would spark another outburst. Instead, she tried to focus on caring for Samantha and managing what little stability she could create in the household. Samantha was caught in the middle. She loved her mother deeply, and seeing her constantly belittled tore at her heart. She also could not ignore the reality that her father's neglect meant she had to live with less than most of her peers. While her classmates bought new clothes, phones, or cars for their 16th birthdays, Samantha lived with the bare minimum. She wore the same jeans until they faded, borrowed books from the library rather than buying her own, and quietly declined invitations that required money she didn't have. In a town like Millfield, appearances mattered. Families went to church on Sundays, attended school football games on Fridays, and tried to maintain a picture of unity. The Hayes family rarely fit into that mold. Robert seldom showed up to community events, and when he did, his behavior was often marked by arrogance or impatience. Linda, embarrassed, kept her distance from neighbors. Samantha found solace in her school library and long walks through the quiet fields surrounding town. It was her way of escaping, even if only for a few hours. The breaking point was not a single moment but a long accumulation of smaller incidents that built over years. Samantha's resentment grew stronger with each argument she overheard, each time her father spent money on himself while Linda struggled to pay bills, and each instance of humiliation her mother endured. By July 2021, Samantha's relationship with her father had deteriorated into near silence. When they did speak, it was often sharp and filled with tension. On July 10, 2021, for example, Robert returned home late, stumbling through the front door at nearly midnight. Linda was already in bed, exhausted after her shift at the diner. Samantha sat quietly in the living room, pretending to read a book. Robert, smelling strongly of alcohol, began complaining about dinner not being ready, even though he had skipped the meal hours earlier. When Linda came down to check on the noise, Robert lashed out, accusing her of being lazy and ungrateful. Samantha sat frozen, gripping her book tightly, her jaw clenched as she watched the man she could no longer recognize as a father. It was one of many nights that planted darker thoughts in her mind. Despite the turmoil, Samantha tried to maintain a normal teenage life. She still attended school events, kept up with her homework, and spoke with a small circle of friends. But inside, she carried a growing burden. She confided in no one, not even her closest friend, about the chaos at home. In Millfield, secrets often stayed behind closed doors, and Samantha had learned early that speaking about her father's behavior would only invite judgment or pity. Her mother, sensing the strain, often whispered reassurances late at night. "It won't always be like this," Linda would tell her daughter, brushing back her hair. "You'll go to college and you'll get out of here. Things will get better." Samantha wanted to believe those words. She wanted to imagine a future far away from Maplewood Lane, a future where her father's shadow no longer loomed over her life. But deep down, she was beginning to lose hope that such an escape was possible. The tension in the Hayes household during the summer of 2021 was like a storm waiting to break. Every argument, every insult, every night Robert failed to come home on time only added to the sense of inevitability. Samantha had spent her entire life enduring the weight of her father's neglect and cruelty. Now, with her 17th birthday behind her and adulthood approaching, she was beginning to feel a dangerous mix of anger and desperation. It was in this fragile state of mind that the events of August 14, 2021, began to unfold. A night that started like so many others in the Hayes household, with raised voices and bitter accusations, would soon spiral into a tragedy that would change the course of Samantha's life forever. August 14, 2021, began as an unremarkable Saturday in Millfield, Ohio. The late summer heat was heavy, pressing down on the small town, and the sound of cicadas filled the air. For Samantha Hayes, the day passed quietly. She spent the morning in her bedroom, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, and later helped her mother fold laundry. Nothing about the first half of that day suggested how it would end. Robert Hayes had left the house early, saying he had some work to check on, though Linda and Samantha both knew what that meant. He was likely meeting friends at a bar or seeing one of the women he had been linked to. By evening, Linda had cooked a simple dinner, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, but Robert never showed up. Linda and Samantha ate in silence, accustomed to his absence, though the unspoken tension lingered between them. Samantha could see the fatigue in her mother's eyes, the disappointment she tried to hide behind small talk about Samantha's upcoming school year. As the clock neared 10 p.m., the familiar sound of Robert's truck pulling into the driveway broke the stillness of the night. Samantha's body tensed immediately. She had learned to read the signs: the uneven rumble of the engine, the slamming of the truck door, the heavy footsteps approaching the front door. When Robert entered the house, the smell of alcohol preceded him. His face was flushed, his words slightly slurred. "Why is it so quiet in here?" he barked, dropping his keys on the counter. His eyes darted toward the untouched plate of food Linda had left for him hours earlier. "Cold dinner again? You can't even keep a meal warm?" Linda, who had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looked up slowly. "Robert, the food has been here since 6 o'clock. You didn't come home. You never called." Her voice was calm, but Samantha could hear the weariness in it. She had heard this exchange too many times before. Robert's response was sharp, fueled by both alcohol and the bitterness that seemed to define him. "Don't start with me, Linda. I work my ass off, and I come home to a wife who can't do the simplest things." Samantha, sitting in the living room with her homework spread across the coffee table, felt her chest tighten. She had learned to stay quiet, to stay out of the way when arguments erupted. But tonight something was different. Tonight, her father's words seemed even harsher, his tone more cruel. Linda tried again, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't support us, Robert. You barely give us anything. I'm the one keeping this house together. And yet you still..." Before she could finish, Robert slammed his hand against the table, making the teacup rattle. "Don't you dare lecture me in my own house," he shouted. The noise startled Samantha. She looked up, her hands trembling as she gripped her pencil. Her father's towering presence filled the kitchen, his anger spilling into every corner of the house. For years she had watched him belittle her mother, tear her down piece by piece, but tonight, it felt unbearable. Robert turned his anger toward Samantha next. His eyes narrowed as he saw her watching. "And you," he snapped, pointing a finger at her. "Sitting there like some useless brat. You think you're better than me? You think you can judge me?" Samantha froze, her breath caught in her throat. Rarely did her father address her directly in his outbursts, but when he did, it cut deeply. Her mother quickly tried to intervene. "Leave her out of this, Robert," Linda pleaded. "She's just a child." But Robert wasn't listening. He staggered a step closer, his face twisted in anger. "She's no child. She's 17, almost grown, and she's just as ungrateful as you are. Do you know what it's like to have two mouths to feed and no appreciation? Samantha could feel the heat rising in her chest, the years of suppressed anger pushing to the surface. For as long as she could remember, she had endured his words in silence. But tonight, something inside her cracked. "I know what it's like to have a father who doesn't care," she shouted, her voice trembling but loud enough to stop him in his tracks. "You don't feed us, you don't support us, and all you do is hurt Mom. You're not a father, you're a burden." The room went silent for a moment. Robert stared at her in disbelief, his face reddening further, his fists clenching at his sides. Linda gasped, covering her mouth, knowing how dangerous it was to provoke him. "You little bitch," Robert growled, stepping toward her. "You dare speak to me like that?" Samantha's heart raced. She stood up instinctively, her legs shaking beneath her. In the kitchen, the glint of a knife caught her eye, the one Linda had used earlier to carve the chicken. It sat on the counter, still unwashed, within arm's reach. Robert's voice grew louder, angrier. "You think you can disrespect me in my own house? I'll teach you some damn respect." Linda stepped between them, her hands outstretched. "Robert, stop. Please don't do this." But Robert shoved her aside, his eyes fixed on his daughter. It was in that split second, with her mother pushed to the ground and her father towering over her, that Samantha made a decision she could never undo. Her hand moved almost without thought, grabbing the knife from the counter. The cool steel felt heavy in her grip. Her pulse pounded in her ears as Robert took another step toward her, his words drowned out by the rush of adrenaline. "Don't you touch me," he roared. But before he could raise a hand, Samantha lunged forward. The knife pierced his chest, the sound sharp and sickening. Robert's eyes widened in shock as he stumbled backward, clutching the wound. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Linda screamed, rushing toward her husband, but Samantha couldn't stop. Years of fear, anger, and resentment poured out of her in that single violent act. She drove the knife forward again, striking him a second time. Robert collapsed onto the living room floor, his breath shallow, his shirt soaked in blood. Samantha stood frozen, the knife still in her hand, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. The reality of what she had done began to sink in. Her father lay dying at her feet, her mother sobbing beside him, and the house filled with the heavy silence of irreversible tragedy. Neighbors later reported hearing Linda scream, sharp and desperate, followed by frantic cries for help. Within minutes, police sirens cut through the night, rushing toward the small house on Maplewood Lane. For Samantha, the act was both a release and a condemnation. She had ended the years of torment, but in doing so, she had crossed a line that could never be undone. The night of August 14, 2021, was one that Millfield, Ohio, would never forget. At 11:02 p.m., the Millfield Police Department received a frantic 911 call from Linda Hayes. Her voice, shaky and broken, repeated the same words again and again. "My husband's been stabbed, my daughter. Oh God, please send someone quickly." The dispatcher kept her calm long enough to send 2 patrol cars and an ambulance racing toward Maplewood Lane. When officers arrived at 11:11 p.m., the sight that greeted them was one of chaos. The front door stood ajar, the porch light flickering above it. Inside, the air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood. Robert Hayes lay on the living room floor, his shirt drenched crimson, his body motionless except for faint, shallow gasps that rattled in his throat. Beside him, Linda knelt in tears, pressing a towel desperately against the wound as if she could somehow stop the life from leaving him. Samantha Hayes stood a few feet away, still clutching the kitchen knife. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. She did not move or speak when the officers entered. It was as though she had become frozen in that moment of violence, unable to step back from what she had done. "Put the knife down," one officer commanded, his voice firm but not aggressive. Samantha's eyes flicked toward him, then back at her father's fading form. Slowly, almost mechanically, she opened her fingers and let the knife clatter onto the hardwood floor. Paramedics rushed in moments later, lifting Robert onto a stretcher. They worked frantically, applying pressure and attempting to stabilize him as they carried him out to the waiting ambulance. Linda tried to follow, but an officer gently held her back. "Ma'am, we need you to stay here for now," he said softly. Linda sobbed, nodding, her body shaking from the shock of what had just unfolded. Inside the living room, the scene was quickly secured. Officers photographed the bloodstains, the knife, and the disarray of the furniture. The dining table was still set with dishes from dinner, a haunting reminder of how ordinary the evening had started before spiraling into violence. Detective Mark Collins, a seasoned investigator with 20 years on the force, arrived at the scene shortly after midnight. He had handled countless domestic disputes in Millfield, but the severity of this case was different. A 17-year-old girl stabbing her own father was not something this town had seen before. Collins began with the basics. He separated Linda and Samantha to gather initial statements. Linda, still in shock, could barely form coherent sentences. Her words tumbled out in fragments. "He came home drunk, he was yelling, he pushed me, she tried to stop him." Tears streamed down her face as she recounted the argument, the escalation, and finally, the stabbing. Samantha, on the other hand, sat silently at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her. When Collins asked her what had happened, she took a long pause before answering. "He was going to hurt her," she whispered. "I couldn't let him." Her statement was calm, almost detached, but her eyes told a different story. They were filled with fear, sorrow, and the dawning realization of what she had done. Collins recognized the mix of emotions immediately. It was not the face of a cold-blooded killer, but of someone who had reached a breaking point. At 1:15 a.m., news came from the hospital. Robert Hayes had been pronounced dead at 12:48 a.m. from multiple stab wounds to the chest. The confirmation sent another wave of sobs through Linda, who clutched her face in her hands as if trying to block out the truth. Samantha sat still, her gaze fixed on the table, her lips pressed tightly together. By law, the officers had no choice. Samantha was placed under arrest for the fatal stabbing of her father. The sight of the young girl being led out of her home in handcuffs was one that neighbors would remember for years. A crowd had already gathered on Maplewood Lane, drawn by the flashing lights of police cars and the ambulance. Whispers spread quickly through the group. "It's the Hayes girl, she killed her father." In a small town, news traveled fast, and this was a story that would dominate every conversation in Millfield for weeks to come. At the police station, Samantha was processed like any other suspect, though the officers handling her could not ignore the fact that she was barely more than a child. Fingerprints were taken, a mugshot captured, and she was placed in a holding room. Collins sat across from her during the formal interview, his tone steady but not unkind. "Tell me what happened tonight, Samantha," he said. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "He was screaming at Mom again. He pushed her. He came at me. I just wanted him to stop. I wasn't thinking. I just grabbed the knife." Collins listened carefully, noting every detail. From his years of experience, he understood the dynamics of domestic violence, the way years of abuse could build pressure until it exploded. Still, the law was clear. Robert Hayes was dead and Samantha's actions had caused it. Meanwhile, Linda was taken to the station as well to give a full statement. She defended her daughter passionately, insisting that Samantha had acted out of fear and desperation. "She was protecting me," Linda said firmly through tears. "She was protecting herself. He was going to hurt us. You don't know what it was like living with him." For investigators, the challenge was clear. They had to determine whether this was an act of self-defense or a crime born out of anger. The autopsy would reveal the number of stab wounds and the angle of the attack, details that would become critical in court. For now, all they had was a frightened teenager, a grieving mother, and a community stunned by the violence that had erupted in one of its quietest neighborhoods. By dawn on August 15th, the Hayes house was sealed off with yellow police tape. Officers continued to document evidence, marking blood spatters, collecting fingerprints, and bagging the knife that had ended Robert Hayes' life. Reporters from nearby towns began arriving, eager to cover the shocking case of a teenage girl accused of patricide. For Millfield, a place where little ever happened, the Hayes tragedy was about to become headline news. As the initial shock of Robert Hayes' death began to settle, the investigation moved into its second phase. What started as a straightforward case of a teenage daughter stabbing her father soon revealed deeper layers that painted a very different picture of Robert, Linda, and Samantha's life inside the house on Maplewood Lane. Detective Mark Collins was the first to sense that there was more to the story. During his 2 decades of service, he had seen many domestic disputes turn violent, but the details of this case didn't fit neatly into one category. Samantha's calm but broken statements, Linda's unwavering defense of her daughter, and the neighbors' hushed whispers about Robert's late-night habits all suggested that Robert Hayes's death wasn't just the result of a single heated argument. It was the culmination of years of dysfunction. The autopsy report arrived on August 18, 2021, 3 days after the stabbing. Dr. Emily Carter, the county medical examiner, confirmed that Robert had died from 2 deep stab wounds to the chest, one of which pierced his heart. But there were other details. Robert's body bore multiple bruises and older scars, evidence of previous injuries not connected to the stabbing. Some were consistent with falls or accidents, but others suggested altercations. This raised immediate questions. Had Robert been involved in other fights, or had violence inside the home been more frequent than anyone admitted? While the medical examiner worked, Collins and his team interviewed neighbors around Maplewood Lane. What they learned began to reshape the entire case. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 2 houses down, admitted she had often heard shouting late at night. It wasn't just arguments, she said. It was screaming, things breaking. I told myself it wasn't my business, but now I wish I had said something. Another neighbor, Tom Reynolds, revealed that he had seen Robert more than once at a bar called the Rusty Nail, often with women who were not his wife. Everybody knew, Reynolds said. He'd come in with a lady on his arm, buy her drinks, act like he didn't have a family waiting for him at home. The most shocking discovery came from Robert's financial records. With a warrant, investigators accessed his bank statements and credit card transactions. The evidence was damning. Large amounts of money spent at bars, motels on the outskirts of town, and even transfers to an unknown woman in a neighboring county. Meanwhile, Linda's accounts showed her struggling to keep utilities paid on time, sometimes overdrawing to cover groceries. For Collins, this painted a clearer picture of the Hayes household. Robert had been draining resources on his personal vices while leaving his wife and daughter to struggle. The narrative of Samantha as an ungrateful teenager began to crumble. Instead, it looked like she and her mother had been trapped in a cycle of neglect and emotional abuse for years. The breakthrough came when Linda, during a second interview, admitted something she hadn't shared before. Sitting across from Collins, her hands clasped tightly together, she whispered, "He hit me. Not every day but often enough. When he was drunk, when he was angry. I never called the police. I was too scared, and I didn't want Samantha to lose her father completely. But she saw. She always saw. This revelation shifted everything. If Samantha had grown up not only hearing arguments but also witnessing physical abuse, the psychological toll on her was immense. It also strengthened the argument that her actions, while violent, may have been driven by years of fear and desperation. Collins shared his findings with the county prosecutor, who now faced a complex decision. Charging Samantha with murder seemed too simple. The evidence suggested that Robert's abuse and neglect played a direct role in the events of August 14th. Still, the fact remained: Samantha had taken a knife and fatally stabbed her father. The law demanded accountability, but the context could not be ignored. As the story spread beyond Millfield, the media seized on the narrative. Headlines in regional newspapers read, "Teen accused of killing father in Ohio domestic dispute. Behind closed doors. Abuse allegations surface in Hayes family tragedy." Public opinion was divided. Some saw Samantha as a murderer who had crossed the line. Others viewed her as a victim herself, driven to extremes by the environment she had been forced to endure. The twist that truly shook the community came when Collins uncovered that Robert's suspected mistress, a woman named Angela Morris, had recently filed a restraining order against him. She claimed Robert had become violent during their affair, threatening her when she tried to end it. This information suggested a broader pattern of abusive behavior. Robert's violence extended beyond his family. When Collins presented these findings, even some of the toughest officers in the department shifted their view of Samantha. What had once seemed like a tragic but clear-cut crime now looked like the explosive breaking point of a long history of abuse. Linda, meanwhile, became more vocal in her support of her daughter. In an emotional statement to local reporters, she said, "People think they know what happened, but they don't. My daughter isn't a killer. She's a girl who spent her whole life protecting me when I should have been protecting her." This admission drew sympathy from many in the community. The Hayes family was no longer seen simply as the site of a violent crime, but as the tragic end of years of hidden suffering. For Samantha, held in juvenile detention as the investigation continued, the twist in the case brought a glimmer of hope. Her attorney, a public defender named Rachel Monroe, began building a case that Samantha had acted under extreme emotional duress, if not direct self-defense. Monroe knew it would not be easy, the law was strict, and prosecutors would argue that Samantha had options other than violence. But the new revelations gave her something powerful, a narrative that showed Samantha was not a cold-blooded murderer, but a desperate young girl caught in impossible circumstances. By the end of August 2021, the Hayes case was no longer just about a daughter killing her father. It had become a story about abuse, neglect, and the devastating consequences of silence. The twist in the investigation forced everyone, from the police to the prosecutors, from neighbors to reporters, to confront uncomfortable truths about what had really been happening inside the Hayes household long before the knife was ever picked up. By September 2021, the Hayes case had become the most discussed topic in Millfield and surrounding counties. Every headline carried Samantha's name, every news segment replayed images of her being escorted in handcuffs from her home on Maplewood Lane. What had begun as a domestic tragedy now stood as a test of how the justice system would handle a teenager who killed her father under circumstances marked by years of abuse. The county prosecutor, Daniel Harper, was determined to pursue charges. He announced that Samantha Hayes would be tried as an adult for second-degree murder. His reasoning was blunt. Regardless of age or circumstance, taking a life in such a manner cannot be ignored. We owe justice to Robert Hayes. For Harper, it was not about dismissing the allegations of abuse but about upholding the law. If a precedent was set that abuse justified lethal action without immediate threat, he argued, the legal system would falter. Samantha's defense attorney, Rachel Monroe, saw things differently. She argued that the case was not about cold-blooded murder but about survival. Standing before the press, Monroe stated firmly, "My client is a 17-year-old girl who lived under the constant shadow of fear. On the night of August 14th, she acted not with malice, but in desperation to protect herself and her mother. This was not murder. This was the inevitable breaking point of years of abuse." The courtroom became the battleground where these opposing narratives clashed. On September 20, 2021, Samantha appeared for her arraignment. Dressed in a plain gray jumpsuit, her wrists shackled, she looked more like a child than a dangerous criminal. When the judge asked for her plea, she spoke softly, her voice barely audible, "Not guilty." The room buzzed with tension. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and the weight of her words hung in the air. As the pretrial hearings unfolded, the prosecution presented their argument. They emphasized that Robert Hayes had been unarmed the night of his death. They pointed to the fact that Samantha had stabbed him twice, suggesting intent rather than reflex. Harper's team portrayed Robert, despite his flaws, as a man who had lost his life at the hands of his own daughter. This was not self-defense, Harper declared in court. This was rage. A deliberate act carried out with deadly force. The defense countered with a very different picture. Monroe called Linda Hayes to the stand. With tears streaming down her face, Linda testified about years of verbal abuse, neglect, and physical violence. She spoke of nights when Robert had shoved her against the wall, when he had screamed so loudly that neighbors could hear through closed windows, when Samantha had begged her to leave but she had nowhere to go. "She grew up in fear," Linda said, her voice trembling. "Every day she watched me suffer. Every day she carried that burden. That night he pushed me again. He came at her. She thought he was going to hurt us. She reacted the only way she knew how." The jury sat silently, their faces tense as they listened. Monroe built upon Linda's testimony with expert witnesses. A psychologist testified that children raised in environments of chronic abuse often experience learned helplessness and hypervigilance, leaving them prone to extreme reactions when faced with perceived threats. In Samantha's mind, the psychologist explained, the danger was not hypothetical. It was immediate, overwhelming, and inescapable. The prosecution fought back, arguing that Samantha had options other than violence. She could have run, called 911, or sought help from neighbors. Harper reminded the court that Robert Hayes was intoxicated, unarmed, and physically weakened from years of heavy drinking. There was no imminent threat to her life, Harper insisted. This was retaliation, not self-defense. Outside the courtroom, the public was deeply divided. Some community members rallied in support of Samantha, holding signs outside the courthouse that read, "Justice for Samantha," and "End the silence on abuse." Others, however, saw the case as a dangerous precedent, warning that excusing such violence could unravel the rule of law. Talk shows and radio programs debated the case daily, often sensationalizing details and painting Samantha alternately as a victim or a killer. For Samantha, the pressure was overwhelming. Each court appearance drained her further. She spent her nights in juvenile detention, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the image of her father collapsing to the floor. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind, torn between guilt and a small, fragile voice that told her she had protected her mother. Her mother visited as often as she could, sitting across the glass barrier in the visitation room. "You did what you thought you had to do," Linda would whisper, her hands pressed against the cold divider. "I love you. I'll never stop fighting for you." Samantha would nod, tears streaming down her face, but the weight of what she had done never lifted. As the trial date approached in October, tensions reached their peak. The courtroom was packed each day, the media capturing every glance, every word, every detail. The prosecutor's closing argument was sharp, echoing in the minds of the jury. 17 years old or not, Samantha Hayes chose violence. She chose to end her father's life. The law does not bend for sympathy. Monroe's closing was just as powerful, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on the jurors. This case is not about choosing violence. It is about a child who lived in a home where violence was a daily reality. Samantha Hayes is not a murderer. She is a survivor who reached her breaking point. If you condemn her, you condemn every victim of abuse who has ever been pushed beyond endurance. The jury would soon carry the weight of deciding Samantha's fate. Inside the courtroom, emotions had reached their highest point. Outside, the town of Millfield held its breath, waiting to see whether Samantha Hayes would be condemned as a criminal or recognized as a victim of circumstances far beyond her control. On the morning of October 28, 2021, the courthouse in Millfield, Ohio, was silent except for the shuffle of feet and the low murmur of voices. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and emotional breakdowns, the jury had reached its decision. Samantha Hayes, just 17 years old, sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her attorney, Rachel Monroe, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, whispering something only Samantha could hear. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Daniel Harper stood stiffly, his expression unreadable. The judge entered and everyone rose. After the formalities, the foreperson of the jury delivered the verdict. On the charge of second-degree murder, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant, Samantha Hayes, guilty of voluntary manslaughter." Gasps filled the courtroom. It was not the outcome the prosecution had hoped for, but it was also not the full acquittal Monroe had fought for. Voluntary manslaughter meant the jury had believed Samantha acted under provocation and emotional distress, but still held her accountable for taking Robert Hayes's life. The judge sentenced Samantha to serve 5 years in a juvenile correctional facility, with eligibility for parole after 3. Because of her age, she would remain in the juvenile system rather than being transferred to an adult prison. The sentence reflected the court's attempt to balance justice with compassion. Linda Hayes wept quietly in the gallery, both relieved and heartbroken. She had prayed for her daughter's freedom, but she also knew that the outcome could have been much worse. As bailiffs prepared to escort Samantha away, Linda called out, "I love you, baby. Stay strong." Samantha looked back briefly, her face streaked with tears, and nodded. The media seized on the verdict. Headlines read, "Teen sentenced in father's killing. Abuse allegations shape outcome. Justice or mercy? Ohio court rules in Hayes case." 4 weeks afterward, talk shows debated the implications. Some argued that Samantha had received a lenient sentence considering the severity of her crime. Others believed the system had failed to fully recognize the years of abuse she endured. Inside the community of Millfield, the case left scars. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries now looked at each other differently, reminded that violence and suffering can hide behind closed doors. The Hayes home on Maplewood Lane eventually went up for sale, its rooms emptied but still echoing with the weight of what had happened there. For Samantha, life in juvenile detention was a harsh adjustment, but she received counseling and educational support. Her attorney worked to ensure she had opportunities to heal and prepare for a second chance once she was released. Slowly, she began to write letters to her mother, filling pages with reflections, regrets, and fragile hopes for the future. Linda visited as often as she could, bringing small updates about life outside. She had moved into a smaller apartment, started working part-time, and joined a support group for survivors of domestic abuse. For the first time in years, she felt a measure of freedom, though it came at a terrible cost. In the end, the Hayes case was remembered not only for the violence that ended Robert's life but also for the conversations it sparked about abuse, accountability, and the difficult choices made in the shadows of broken families. Samantha's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that silence in the face of abuse can have devastating consequences, and that justice is never simple when pain runs deep. As Samantha marked the days on her calendar in detention, she held on to one thought: when her sentence ended, she would walk free. Not as the frightened girl she once was, but as someone determined to build a life no longer defined by fear or violence. And though the road ahead would not be easy, she carried with her the quiet strength of survival.